Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're cracking open one of the most comprehensive reviews of the Chernobyl accident. We are going to look at the minute-by-minute failure of that reactor, track the invisible cloud of fallout that poisoned a continent, and uncover the devastating long-term consequences it had and, still has on all of us.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at exactly what went down on that fateful night. Then, we'll follow that invisible radioactive cloud and see who was in its path. After that, we'll get into the signature illness that became the disaster's tragic legacy, and finally, pull out the critical lessons we learned from all this fallout. All right, picture this. It's just after midnight, April 26, 1986, at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in what was then Soviet Ukraine. They're running a routine safety test, but it's about to go catastrophically wrong.
It all started with this fatal mix of a flawed reactor design and just plain old human error. The fuel rods started overheating, and that set off this terrifying chain reaction. First, a shockwave from vaporized coolant just burst the system wide open. Seconds later, a huge steam explosion blows the 1,000-ton steel lid right off the reactor core. And then a second, even bigger explosion completely obliterates the building, sparking a graphite fire that would burn for 10 solid days, just relentlessly pumping a lethal stream of radioactive material straight into the sky.
In the immediate chaos, 134 plant workers and firefighters were diagnosed with acute radiation sickness. It's a horrific condition where your body's cells are basically destroyed from the inside out. And despite all the medical care they could get, 28 of these first responders died within the first 4 months.
So, that was the explosion itself. But the real, insidious threat? You couldn't even see it. The explosion didn't just cause a fire. It unleashed this complex, deadly cocktail of radioactive isotopes directly into the atmosphere.
This table really simplifies the huge list of radioactive materials down to the ones that matter most for our health. So while tons of different isotopes got out, 2 were the real problem. First, you've got iodine-131. It's super potent, but thankfully short-lived. Half of it decays every 8 days. And then there's cesium-137. This one is the long hauler. It sticks around in the environment for decades and is responsible for that long-term contamination of the ground itself.
And this slide right here illustrates a really crucial point. At the time, the only thing we could compare this to were the atomic bombs in Japan. But Chernobyl, it was a completely different animal. It wasn't a single flash. It was a slow, 10-day bleed of radiation. And the main danger wasn't external exposure. It was internal, from breathing this stuff in or eating contaminated food. It meant nobody, absolutely nobody, knew what to expect for the long-term health consequences. So this radioactive plume gets carried by shifting winds and weather patterns, and it creates this patchy, totally irregular pattern of contamination. Think of it less like a uniform blanket of fog and more like spilled ink spreading unevenly. And while Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine definitely got hit the hardest, this was not just a local disaster. It quickly became a global event, with fallout detected thousands of miles away.
So with this invisible cloud spreading everywhere, the big question was, who was actually in its path? Well, researchers have basically broken down the exposed population into 3 distinct major groups, and each one faced a really different kind of risk.
First up, you've got the heroes, right? The emergency workers, the first responders who were battling that fire on day 1. They were followed by this massive group of cleanup workers who were officially called liquidators. And finally, you have the largest group by far, the general population. Millions of men, women, and children just living their lives in these newly contaminated territories.
And just to wrap your head around the sheer scale of this cleanup effort, think about this number. Around 600,000 people. These were the liquidators, civilians, military personnel, who were sent into the radioactive zone over the next 4 years to do everything from decontaminating land to burying machinery and building that massive concrete shell over the ruined reactor.
In the days and months right after the explosion, about 116,000 people were evacuated from that 30-kilometer exclusion zone. Can you imagine? They were told they had just hours to pack, forced to leave their homes, their pets, everything behind, with no idea they would never, ever return.
But the evacuation zone, that was just the beginning. And this is the number that is truly staggering. Beyond those evacuated areas, over 5 million people, including about 1 million kids under the age of 15, just kept on living in territories that were officially recognized as contaminated with that long-lasting cesium-137.
So you've got this massive, unprecedented event exposing millions of people. It created this terrifying medical mystery. What on earth were the long-term health consequences going to be? The whole world was basically watching and waiting. You know, based on all the data from Japan, most experts, they expected to see a big spike in leukemia. But they were wrong. They were looking in the wrong place. The answer turned out to be something else entirely, an epidemic that would become the definitive tragic health signature of Chernobyl.
And the villain in this story turned out to be that short-lived isotope we mentioned earlier, iodine-131. Here's how it worked. It settled on pastures, it was eaten by cows, and then it contaminated their milk. And when people drank this milk, especially children whose thyroids are way more active, that radioiodine delivered a concentrated blast of radiation directly to that small gland in their neck.
And the result was just terrifying. Only a few years after the accident, doctors started seeing this dramatic, unprecedented spike in thyroid cancer, specifically among people who were kids or teenagers back in 1986. This was a huge shock because everyone thought the delay for radiation-induced cancer was supposed to be much longer, something closer to a decade. After years and years of meticulous research from scientists all over the world, the verdict was in, and it was undeniable. The evidence was crystal clear. Internal exposure to radioiodine from the Chernobyl fallout was the direct cause of this cancer epidemic. No question about it. But here's where it gets even more tragic and honestly kind of fascinating from a scientific point of view. A pre-existing condition made a bad situation so much worse. In regions where the population already had an iodine deficiency, their thyroids were essentially starved for iodine, so they just aggressively soaked up the radioactive version. This amplified the danger, making the risk of developing cancer over 3 times higher. Okay, so let's shift gears to our final section. For all its absolute horror, what did we actually learn from this? How did this devastating event ultimately shape our modern understanding of nuclear safety, disaster response, and public health? Well, the takeaways from Chernobyl are pretty stark, and they're clear as day. We learned that nuclear accidents don't care about borders. We learned that getting quick, honest information to the public isn't just helpful, it is a primary safety measure. And we learned that simple preventative actions and international cooperation are absolutely essential in any crisis of this scale. The initial secrecy from the Soviet authorities had tragic and honestly preventable consequences. They waited 2 days to make an official announcement. That crucial window of time was just lost. If people had been told to shelter, to avoid fresh milk, and to take potassium iodide pills, which basically flood the thyroid so it can't absorb the radioactive stuff, thousands of cancer cases could have been prevented. A later analysis even showed that the cost of providing those pills would have been a tiny fraction of what was eventually spent on cancer treatment. And that really brings us to our final thought. The story of Chernobyl, it's not over. It isn't just something in the history books. It's a living, breathing, scientific, and human story. Long-term studies on the liquidators, the evacuees, and their children are still going on today. And it leaves us with this crucial question. Even now, almost 40 years later, are we really sure we've uncovered all the consequences of those 10 days in April 1986?